can we talk about that Ovando case?
Yeah. So that was a case that happened October 12th, 1996. Ray Perez had only been in crash for 1 year at that point. We didn't find out about this until we debriefed Perez after he had pled. So if I didn't mention it before his second trial, Ray Perez entered a guilty plea and agreed to fully cooperate with prosecutors. He was given immunity for everything except for any murders.
So, Sean, let me jump in there. So the first case against Perez, 8-4, hung jury.
Yep.
The DA's office in LAPD goes back, gets more evidence that more drugs were tampered with, more drugs were stolen and sold on the streets by this guy. They file a second case, and then with that, in the face of that overwhelming evidence, he decides to plead guilty and cut a deal.
That's exactly right. And part of that deal is cooperate. And that is what led to what was really known as the Rampart corruption scandal, because that was based in large part on the huge Pandora's box that was opened by Ray Perez during those debriefs. So one of the cases he told us about, and one of the cases that we did get a conviction in, was him and his partner, Nino Durden, were working what they call an observation point. So they're in an abandoned building. They're in an apartment. They are using that as a vantage point to observe drug dealing so that they can make some busts of some of the gangbangers that are dealing drugs. A guy named Ovando, who he says happened to be squatting in one of the nearby apartments, says they burst in on him. They roughed him up. And eventually, what definitely happened is that one of them, our theory of the case was Nino Durden, shot Ovando in the head. Ovando miraculously survives. There was, according to the accounts that I saw, brain matter on the wall when he was shot in the head, and somehow he survives the shooting. Ray Perez tells us that shooting was completely dirty. And in fact, we had said in our reports that he had burst in on us and tried to assault us with an assault weapon. In fact, we were just rousting him for information. We were pissed off that he was in our OP, our observation point, and we just blew him away. And after they did that, they put what's called a throwdown gun on him, which Ray Perez said most of the cops in crash carried guns that they had either recovered on the streets or obtained by other means, that they could plan on suspects so they could say the suspect was armed at the time a shooting occurred, to providing them with a defense to say it was a legitimate shooting. Ray Perez said they planted that assault rifle on him, and we were able actually to later track that gun. The serial number had been partially erased, but we were able to bring it back up and track that gun to a bust that had been made earlier by Perez and Durden. So that gun definitely did not get there through Ovando. It got there through Ray Perez. That case was really an eye-opener. I mean, when Ray Perez told us of that case and told us that the corruption was very widespread in crash, then we knew we had just a huge mess on our hands. And Nino Durden actually ended up getting convicted of that case. He spent several years in custody. I think he was also convicted on the federal side on that case, and he also went down for shooting Ovando. Strangely enough, Ovando sued the city, won at the time, I think was one of the largest awards against the city of Los Angeles. It was $15 million.
Right.
And I think within a month was on his way to Vegas with a bunch of blow and gets busted for cocaine trafficking.
Yep, he did. He got busted for cocaine trafficking in Nevada. But I think what we didn't mention, Sean, is I think he was paralyzed in that shooting. Was he not? He was in a wheelchair.
He was.
Yeah.
He was. And so the bizarre thing was that during the criminal trial of Ovando, because our office filed a case against Ovando for assaulting 2 police officers, he was at that trial in a wheelchair. And as I said before, Ray Perez, who is amazingly charismatic and a great witness, convinced the jury that he was guilty. In fact, the defense attorney, it was a public defender who I know personally, has said since then she even believed Ray Perez during that trial. He was such a tough witness to cross-examine, according to her. She wasn't surprised at the verdict, and it turns out later that the whole thing was absolutely made up.
Yeah. And what did he do? He did 2 years. He ended up doing 2 years before he was released.
Yeah, 2 years out of a 23-year sentence before he was finally released. That was one of the first things our office did when Ray Perez told us that. First thing we did was file what's called a writ of habeas corpus. That is rarely filed by prosecutors. It's usually something defense attorneys file to say, hey, my client's rights were violated. We did that right away because you can't have somebody in prison when you have evidence like that he's innocent.
Right.
Yeah. Jeez.
So Ray Perez is debriefed for months after that and starts to lay out what he says is rampant corruption throughout the Rampart crash unit. He says that it is routine for officers in Rampart crash to beat suspects, to plant drugs on them, to plant cases on them. One of the bizarre, there's so many bizarre allegations made by Perez. He alleged incidents where he said he was present, where officers took a gang member, hung him by the heels over a balcony on a multi-story building to get him to give up information on the gang. One of the things that's bizarre about that is that's also an allegation against against Suge Knight.
Right.
With that Suge Knight took a business. Some of that was in business with him and hung him over a balcony. I mean, the parallels are bizarre. And we know Ray Perez hung out at some parties with Suge Knight, according to Russ Poole. So I don't know. Is that true? Is it not? You know, we were never able to corroborate it. And that was one of the problems with Ray Perez. Ray Perez is a liar and all day long. He's a perjurer. He is toxic to a prosecution. We certainly want to hear what he has to say because he's giving us a lot of things that, at least in some cases, we're able to corroborate. But he's toxic as a witness because he's a proven perjurer.
Yeah, so let's talk about a couple of the officers that he provided information on or he, quote, gave up. Edward Ortiz, Brian Liddy, Paul Harper, and Michael Buchanan. Yeah. And that's, to me, that's an interesting case because of the prosecution of those four, because of what, and I'm curious to hear if this is accurate or not, but I've seen stories told that charges were filed 3 days before the statute expired and that there was tremendous pressure from the mayor's or from the chief of police to file charges. Talk about that case and what the allegations were and what eventually happened with these officers. Yeah.
You know, one of the things that was bizarre about this case, and especially as a young prosecutor on this trial team, is, you know, we have a relationship of trust with our investigators, right? It is fundamental to what we do. And in this case, we're working with LAPD and we're working with our own DA investigators developing this case. At one point, Chief Parks directs our investigators not to share any more information with us publicly. I remember finding out about that and just being completely shocked. It's like, how can you cut us out of this investigation? And his excuse was, well, the feds are investigating, so we're going to give everything to them.
Sean, let me interrupt there. So he told the LAPD investigators not to share any more information with the DA's office.
That's right. They cut us off completely. Yep. And of course, it resulted in a huge scandal. And the police commission ordered him to reverse his position, and he did. But only after Gil Garcetti had to go out, who was the district attorney at the time, go out publicly and accuse Chief Parks of obstruction of justice. So it was a huge deal that LAPD was basically trying to freeze us out of this investigation. The other thing that happened during this case, we prepared our first round of search warrants, and I believe it was on Ortiz and Liddy and Harper and Buchanan. We're working with internal affairs at LAPD and our own investigators. By the time they go out at early in the morning to serve those search warrants, all of those targets have been tipped that we were coming. That tells you that there's a fundamental break in you know, that trust relationship between us and our investigators. I don't know if it's them or their chain of command or somebody else, you know, that somehow was in the know. But given that all these guys are armed, because they're obviously police officers, they're targets of criminal investigations, to tip them off a search warrant is coming, not just, you know, extreme obstruction of justice, but puts our investigators at risk, right?
Yeah.
But they all knew. And I remember finding out when our investigators came back, finding out that these guys all knew the warrants were coming, and thinking to myself, damn, like we have to do this by ourselves. We can't trust anyone from LAPD in this case. That was something that really made this case very difficult. So, was there a push by the chief of police? In some respects, yeah, because he wanted to have a one and done, right? He wanted to, let's nail somebody, let's get this case past us, and let's move on, right? And so did our office cave into that pressure? Not from my point of view, because frankly, part of the problem is that our investigation was being undercut by the very people who were supposed to be helping us make the investigation.